I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker now. Peter is the author of the popular book Left at East Gate. He's a consultant, producer, photographer, artist, New York City tour guide, activist, investigative writer, much sought after guest speaker, and just an all-around great guy to know. So please help me welcome Mr. Peter Robbins.
Is this working? Are we live?
No, we are.
Okay. Thank you, Stacy.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon. They don't have a box for me, so I hope you can see me over the monitor here. It's really good to be back in Phoenix. I was last here in February, some of you know, to give a very different kind of talk than the one I'm going to give tonight, and this afternoon. And the one I'm going to do today is actually very different than any other talk I've given. And I'd have to say, without stretching the truth, I've probably spoken on the Rendlesham Forrest UFO incident starting, I guess the first talk was 1988 or so. The last one was last night. They have been to, in one case, a group of 12 fairly inebriated people and a dog in a back room of a pub in Yorkshire, to more than 1,000 people at the Royal College of Science and Technology in London, and everything in between. This one is very different because rather than talk about my co-author of the British bestseller Left at East Gate, an accomplishment I'm eternally proud of, or try to give you a survey or an overview of the case, I need to do something that I really don't want to do. But it needs to be done, and I'm really the only person to do it, which is offer a critique of one of the key individuals involved in this case, and why I feel attention needs to be brought to certain behavior of his, and why this seems to be going on. This was a talk I had planned to give last month at a conference in the United Kingdom. Actually, it would have been 2 days ago, or it would have been a month. And I was not really feeling well, and I just really didn't have the stomach for it. So I gave more of a focus on the positive, which is where I like to put my attention in this field and in life. And I thought, well, I've got talks coming up in Sedona and Phoenix. I'm going to work this out for these audiences. And, like a project that a big part of your high school grade is going to be based on, that you're resisting doing, and, you keep putting off, and then, you got to. I have been futzing around with this and trying to get myself worked up to do it. And I thought ultimately the strategy should be, the first part of the talk would be to focus on the positive, give you bullet points on what Larry and I accomplished in the course of writing this book, the tremendous audience it reached, the people of influence who it impacted upon, why we are credible, and then segue to the second part into my critique. Also for myself, psychologically, it was a structure I felt would empower me to deal with material that I was not really comfortable dealing with. And so I tried that last night, and it was a wonderful audience. I had a great time. And when they told me, they made a big mistake. They told me the little church hall we had, that we didn't have to be out by any special time. 18 hours later, I still had not completely gotten to the meat and potatoes of what I wanted to do. And although it was a wonderful afternoon, evening, and we had a great time, I think, I realized I have got to rework this. And finished up my day at about 2 in the morning last night, got up at 8, came right out here, so I've had exactly 8 minutes to do all the reworking. And I need you to indulge me a little bit, and I've never asked an audience this, which is, I think what I'm about to do is important work, and I need your help. Not as people who are fans of my work or admire my way of presenting things or think I'm a nice guy. I need you to help me understand what I could be doing better And if I'm belaboring a point, or if you think I'm not being fair, because in fact, I am a nice guy, and I will always give people the benefit of the doubt. I will treat somebody new in my life with respect, admiration, every good wish, but God help them if they cross me and I find out. I will take them down with the English language, and I will do it in a very specific series of ways. My co-author is a tough guy. He's much more circumspect than I am based on what he has been through. And speakers you're going to have in October, Jim Peniston and John Burroughs, they have a right to be more cautious than a lot of us in life. And Larry and I have been a great team because we tend to temper each other's points of view. And some of you may or may not be aware that some months back, actually starting last autumn or so, we started to be methodically attacked on the internet in terms of Larry's credibility as a witness, my ethics, my viability as a researcher, investigator, and writer, the honesty, the facts in our book. And it was really rough going to a point where I started to question a bigger picture, which is that this has been going on and off for as long as I've been in this field. And when I say this field, I don't mean ufology, I mean the field of studies around the Rendlesham Forest UFO incident, which many of you know is far and away Great Britain's best known and best documented UFO incident. It's sometimes referred to in the media as Britain's Roswell. Well, it has nothing to do with Roswell in terms of shape, strategy, dynamics, specifics, but it's their best known case, and in that sense, that's a fair, popular culture term. And the dynamic I'm talking about is these men who were good young Americans who joined the service for all the right old-fashioned reasons that men and more recently women have done for millennia. Serve your country, see the world, fight for what you know is right, have a coming-of-age adventure. Some of you have been through this and you know what I'm talking about. These, in this case, young men who signed on, did it in part as a wave of patriotism came over America after kind of 15-year clearing point in the American psyche after Vietnam. And one of the things that galvanized a number of them, including my co-author, Larry Warren, and why he joined up, in part, was spurred by the Iranian militants grabbing American hostages, and many of you remember that, and that they were released the day that President Reagan was sworn in. So Larry signed up the summer of 1980, went through his basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in August with some special kind of quirky aspects to the training. A series of classes, programs, interviews relative to, have you ever seen a UFO? Do you believe in psychic phenomena? Which other men involved in these cases, in this event, also went through. Just a little interesting subtext. He had two specialty areas of his training: anti-terrorism work. The Islamic terrorists were not even a gleam in the eye of history, but the IRA, and there were other regional terrorists around the world. And he ended up in England, which is his country of choice, at a base called RAF Bentwaters, which is about 70 miles northeast of London, in a very pastoral area of England known as Suffolk, East Anglia. And I realize even right now I'm starting to go off topic, and I could just go on about this aspect of things. But I know that some of you here are not that familiar with the incident. Many of you do know it, or have read Left at Eastgate, or have seen the documentaries. Very briefly, on a series of 3 nights in a row between Christmas and New Year's 1980, a series of incursions, landings, incidents occurred on and around the Rendlesham Forest, which is a forest complex in which there are 2 highly secured NATO bases. RAF Woodbridge, which still is an RAF base, manned by about 5,000 men. RAF Bentwaters, which at the time was a highly secured United States Air Force base. That base had been leased to the Americans during World War II, and we never kind of gave it up until 1992 or so, when it was decommissioned and sold off to private hands and is now being developed for private purposes. Larry was stationed there in early December 1980. These events took place in late December, and they involved a number of things. When Jim and John are here to talk to you in October, you'll learn from the horse's mouths the fascinating story of the first night. In John's case, he was involved in another night as well. And I'm not even going to try to characterize their experience. It would be, I don't have to, you'll hear it from them. The second night, crafts came down into the woods. The first night also, beams of light were shown into the weapons storage area. And that is the nuclear weapons storage area, which brings up an important subtext to the story, which is that by virtue of our treaty with Great Britain in 1980, we were not allowed to have nuclear ordnance in the United Kingdom, and yet we did. And it was stored under this twin base complex, something like 30 kilotons. That is a lot of ordnance. Hiroshima, I believe, was between 5 and 10 kilotons. A 1 kiloton nuclear device, and these were what they euphemistically called tactical devices. They were not on the tip of an ICBM. Some of them were so small, the madness of war-thinking people at the time, they were made to be launched off the back of vehicles. A 1 kiloton device sets up a circle 10 miles in diameter, everything within which is dead or dying. The bullseye, so to say, that center mile, is glass. We had a lot of nukes there. And the UFOs that came in over that zone shone beams of light down into it, a lot of moisture in the air, 8 squadrillion little moisture things hanging there so you could see the line as if it was drawn, and somehow affected the ordnance. Obviously did not affect it in the worst way, or life would have turned out different here. This is something that has happened repeatedly. And those of you that had heard my colleague and good friend Robert Salas speak about the Malmstrom Air Force Base UFO UK nuke encounter, or read Bob Hastings' fine book, UFOs and Nukes, know that this is part of the story here. So with that understood, I'm going to begin by reading you 2 quotations. They're from a good man. At the time of these events, he was a sergeant in the United States Air Force. He was a member of the Air Force Security Corps, the 81st TAC Division B Flight, along with Larry Warren, my co-author and good friend. And his name is Adrian Bustinza. And during Larry's event, one which you will be told by some people never happened, or if it did was so minimal and etc., it's real, it happened, it's extremely important. He stood next to Larry during these events. And Adrian has more recently made some statements on the internet. He has been in touch discreetly with certain witnesses, but he, like me, if I had been there, this is no hero. My co-author put himself on the line as the whistleblower in this case, and he is still paying the price for it. And Adrian knows all the players. And what I'm going to read you, the first quote here, is from a letter that he sent Larry after our book came out in 1997. Adrian, by the way, knew that he was going to talk about this to such a degree and wanted part of his story to get out as well as Larry wanted his story to get out, that he asked Larry to take his story and incorporate it into Larry's. A white lie in the service of a large truth. Something I generally do not subscribe to in life nor in this work. But I wasn't there. I wasn't going through this. And I think in the big picture, there's an ethics that overrides certain rules. And I think this was one of those cases. Larry did it, and several years later, being the honest person he is, said he did it. And of course, everybody in the world jumped on him. You changed your story. You didn't tell the truth. And this is something that still haunts him. And it happened one more time when he gave a writer who was a friend of mine in England, Georgina Bruni, the late, great, a wonderful writer who wrote essentially a follow-up book to this called You Can't Tell the People. Georgina, Larry confided to her the name of a man who had taken a photograph of this event as it was happening, and then realized that he had overstepped what he really should have done, and then tried to convince her that the information he had given her was not true, which caused her to be very circumspect about him. And the book is very schizophrenic toward Larry. He screwed up. He's a human being. That understood the statement from Adrian from the first, from 97. And this is specifically, again, in a letter to Larry Warren. No one can give us back what we lost over there. All people will do is rip us off and never understand the truth. I wish I didn't encourage you to go public. None of us knew what we were getting into, but I guess we never really had any choice. God bless you and stay safe. This next statement was posted on a terrific Facebook page that for any of you that are truly interested in following the dynamics of this story, hearing witnesses speak, hearing some of the most informed investigators talk, and just folks like you who are interested in this, who are asking the questions, who are getting into dialogue with other people to learn more about it. The name of the site, the Facebook page, I think, is the Rendlesham Forest Lone Ranger UFO Sightings. Just Google it. I mean, go on Facebook if you're on there. It's a really wonderful, freewheeling exchange of information with people from all over Europe, all over England, and all over America. And as I recall, the administrators of the site are all Rendlesham Forest witnesses and veterans. Okay, this was posted in March. Believe me, they were there and it was real, and I was not drugged. I was threatened, yeah, definitely. Threatened by the very same people that we were working for, our government. And this is the very reason I will not go forth with interviews and even try to get involved. Because every time I turn around and I read all the nonsense that everyone talks about when Larry, Jim, or John say and or write something, everybody wants to jump in and analyze everything and give their version. Well, if you weren't there, I say stay out or just hear them. They may not agree, but I will attest for all three of them. I will back them, and I am aware of a lot of others. There were actually 3 different nights, and this was all what was involved in. But don't tell everybody, because you'll only get ridiculed like everybody else is trying to ridicule everyone else. Yeah, that's right. The Hall tapes do sound staged, but you know what? I was there, and I'm on those tapes, and they are as real as you are alive, my friend. Throughout these events, one officer's name is front and center, and that's a man named Charles I. Halt. Charles, at the time of these events, was the deputy base commander of RAF Bentwaters. He was a lieutenant colonel. He had a long and honorable service. I think he was in Vietnam. He retired as a full colonel in 91, maybe 92, and is a civilian now and out there and occasionally speaking at conferences. He's on documentaries. Some of you may have even heard him speak at last year's UFO Congress, not far from here in the Fort McDowell complex. And Charles, for me, is the center of my talk this afternoon. I have been increasingly disturbed over more than 2 decades that he keeps putting forward a statement or variations on a statement that my co-author should not be taken at his word, and for reasons that we'll go into shortly. And at the same time, I see him as the individual whose words and actions continue to turn these 3 key witnesses on each other. Larry Warren, in 1980, again, was involved in these events in a very dramatic way, and if time allows, I'll get into some of the details on that in the second half of this talk. And Larry, in terms of his character, his temperament, his nature, is a natural whistleblower. That's a term we all know. It's part of popular culture, but it's also a psychological term. And whistleblowers are different than you and I. Whether or not it's the way that they're brought up by their parents, something they observe in life, a key lesson that leaves a lasting impression on them, they're different than you and I in that when they see a wrong being done, whether or not it's a bullying situation on a schoolyard, or a multinational corporation poisoning a national resource. They get their face right in it. And they put it all on the line to bring it to the attention of the public, and many of them suffer for it. I guess the most famous American whistleblower was a woman named Karen Silkwood. Some of you may know her name because she was the subject of a terrific American film 20-odd years ago, starring Meryl Streep as Ms. Silkwood, a blue-collar woman, single mother, working for a military contractor. Kerr McGee made nuclear components, found out that as a bit of a troublemaker, she had accidentally, in quotes, received a lethal dose of radiation, and she was going to do her damnedest to bring this to the attention to the public. Died on her way to a meeting with the New York Times reporter in a quote-unquote freak car accident. Larry didn't die, but he identified himself as a troublemaker early on and thought that the wisest thing he could do would be to get out of the service with an honorable discharge and try to get back to living a life. Now, he received that discharge in May of 1981, 6 months after the events, and moved back to upstate New York and did his best to try to get back to normal. But Larry had had earlier paranormal experiences, including 1 or 2 with his mother. His mother was so interesting to us, and I worked as Bud Hopkins' assistant for several decades. But at this point, Bud was so engaged in this that he contacted her and interviewed her, and she described the inside of a craft to him. And this is a very proper Bostonian, nice Christian lady up there, but that's Larry's mom. Larry was not totally thrown by the other intelligences, the machine of advanced technology. The thing that impacted on him the most, and indeed Jim and John, other men involved, well, I can't speak for Jim and John, was what was then done to these men, in some cases within 24 hours. In Larry's case, he was taken against his will, chemically subdued, brought to a facility below these bases, and subjected to programming that I characterized on Disneyland on acid. The idea here, and Jim and John will describe to you, I hope, aspects of what they remember, that false memories are put in your head. The idea being that your real memories are wild enough, and if the false ones mix with them, that if you ever decide to truly break security and talk about your memories, you will sound like a lunatic. But hopefully, of course, just the fear of God aspect will keep you quiet enough. It didn't work with Larry, and by 1982, he had had it. He was post-traumatic stress disordered out. His behavior had changed. He was drinking. He was angry 24/7. His friends, his family hardly recognized him. He was not a pleasant person to be around. And one way or the other, he made his way through introduction to Larry Fawcett, a Connecticut State Police investigator, a member of the Connecticut State, well, a police officer, a lieutenant in the Coventry, Connecticut Police Department. Larry was a crack investigator. He wrote a UFO cover-up book in the 80s with Barry Greenwood. The title escapes me at the moment. But he was the first one to do serious interviews with Larry Warren. And Larry essentially outed everyone he could remember, saw, or knew, or understood was involved. He did not have anybody's permission to tell Larry Fawcett their names or characterize their involvement, but he did it because he felt he had to. Right, wrong, you decide. That's more than I can make a judgment on. Anyway, Larry Fawcett then took this information that Larry Warren had given him, and Larry Warren alone put it in the form of a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act action, working with a guy named Bob Todd, a paralegal at CAUSE, a now defunct organization, Citizens Against UFO Secrecy. It was filed, and the request resulted some months later in the release of a single-page UFO document called the HALT document by normal parlance. And again, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, so let me try to get back to the paper. By the way, those of you that have heard me speak know that I could be reincarnated from a member of the old Soviet Politburo and stand up here and rattle on for 6 hours until your ears fall off and you want to kill yourselves. And I can do it without a note card. However, I also sometimes have to literally create scripts for myself and apply my actor's training to memorizing them or half memorizing them so that I can speak in a way that if I could remember all this stuff, that it might sound like I would actually sound. So I apologize for having to keep my nose in the papers here for part of the time. Okay. Halt's reaction on being informed by the FOIA office that this document was in fact about to be released. He was not being contacted to find out if it was okay. It was a courtesy that is done in cases. The document, by the way, looked a lot like that. And what it does is it compresses, it edits, it redacts, it minimalizes the events of late December 1980, but it's on the record on an Air Force letterhead. It is a report attesting to the reality of these events. And as he has said to me in person and Larry, as he has said in television treatments, as he said at conferences, when they asked for a comment, I said yes. Burn it. He knew the blowback of this thing being made public was not going to bode well for his military career or his private life. And he was correct in both senses. He was referred to behind his back as the UFO colonel. The military culture, as many of you know, is fairly unforgiving and kind of macho. And, oh, you saw a UFO? And Charles ultimately had the courage to go forward and talk about his event on the third night, not to be confused with Larry's event on the third night. We're talking quarter-mile away, several hundred yards, whatever. And he said, and if I'm off in this quote, it's by one word, whatever it was that my men and I saw that night was not built by any government on earth. One would say, good for you, Charles Hall. That's a heroic thing for an honorably retired United States Air Force officer to say, and it's true. However, there's an irony to that, which is that ask him about the nuclear treaty violation, ask him about other aspects of this story, and he is mum. He, like Jim and John, bless their hearts, are retired, fully pensioned members of the United States Air Force fraternity, still on their national security oaths. Jim and John have as much as suggested that somebody like Larry, who ultimately was also the person to out the nuclear presence on the base. We did not have a treaty with Britain regarding this, which was very embarrassing to our government and to Her Majesty's government. Or like Robert Salas, who co-wrote a book called Broken Arrow. What's Bob Salas's book called?
Fated Giant.
Fated Giant, another aphorism in the Air Force. Fated Giant, that these men who essentially made public nuclear secrets that we had, you know, who doesn't know that we had nukes in the Midwest in the 60s, but that this activity, by violating the military order that they were given, they didn't use the word treason, but they suggested it was close to that, and I object to that. Anyway, Charles Hall learned fairly quickly that the source of the release of this was Larry Warren, and he was not happy about that. And from the get-go, there has been an animus there. Last year, for the first time since Charles and I actually were face-to-face in the early 90s, when Larry and I conducted an extensive interview with him, which appears in Left at Eastgate, I was on the podium and I actually got to look him in the eye, sitting there in the 7th row or something, and say words to the effect of, Charles, I am sorry for the impact that my co-authors going forward had on your life. I know it cost you. I know you didn't want to be made public. I know it was not pleasant. And I'm sorry for that. However, I am and will remain eternally proud of my co-author for doing what he did. We didn't speak a word after that, and he has always refused to appear on programs or at conference venues or at talks with Larry. The only exception has been a radio show that we did in 2010. And again, let me continue from my notes here. Okay, information that Warren had given Fawcett was, of course, the thing that was responsible for the release of this information. And we are now at a point where Charles Hall is actually ridiculed for being associated with this event. On the third night, as a skeptic, he was approached by his assistant Remember, this is between Christmas and New Year's. These 3 nights of events are happening. And a lot of the officers in particular are at a round of parties on and off base. Hall was dressed in civilian, nice clothes, I'm sure, at a party when he was approached, and the gentleman said to him, "They're back." Halt's reaction was, "I have a problem with Peniston and Burroughs' reports. I'm going to go out there in the woods myself, and I'm going to pull together a crew and see what I can find." Goes back to his home, changes into appropriate, field clothing, pulls together a contingent of men. They have night vision gear, radio detection devices, whatever the field kit would require, and he brings his own microcassette recorder. And many of you have heard part of or all of a clip that he recorded that night, where a unknown is coming in right over them, and it shines a beam of light right down to their feet. And you hear the tension in the voices, and this tape is authentic, make no mistake about it. The actual full length of it is 15 or 16 minutes. Something Mr. Halt has never made public, but he told Larry and I, is that he recorded several hours of audio tape that night. And if I were him, I'd want to sell that, because that's pretty valuable stuff on a certain level. But I do hope that at some point in the future he makes that available to all of us, because it's historically important material. Charles Halt has warned people away from accepting Larry's account as a matter of routine. His stated reasons being that Larry was meddled with, a euphemism, of course, for having been subjected to specific programming by American intelligence. Jim Peniston first made the binary code message public, and for those of you that don't know what I'm referring to here, Jim, who was one of the first night witnesses, he and John Burroughs saw a light go down in the forest, radioed in for permission to investigate. There was nothing indicating it was a crash. No ground concussion, no fire, no explosion, nothing like that. Military situation, a loaded piece of property, a very intense moment in the Cold War. They went out, they investigated, and they came upon something from a Steven Spielberg movie, a machine, triangular in shape, equilateral, tapering up, I forget, 7, 9 feet on each side, appearance of black glass, symbols, hieroglyphics, signs, whatever you want to call them. Many of you have seen documentaries where you see part of Jim's notebook and he's copied these symbols out. Jim has privately and publicly for more than 2 decades maintained that his belief is that these were not aliens, extraterrestrials, interdimensionals, what have you, but specifically that they were time travelers from our future. Well, who are any of us to say that we know the unknown? And I have a problem with people who know what is behind this, or who they are, or where they come from. And with all due respect, in questioning them, the responses you get are to the effect of, how can you know this? Well, they told me. Well, no going anywhere with that one. I saw it on a television show. I read it in a book. A friend told me. Again, even if they told you, why would you trust them any more than the United States Air Force, even if they fill your head with goodness and light? Anyway, on December 28th, at the 30th anniversary Rendlesham Conference, back in Woodbridge, Suffolk, East Anglia, on December 28th, 2010, that is, Jim publicly announces